On April 13, 1743, Thomas Jefferson was born on Shadwell Plantation in Goochland County, Virginia. He spent his early childhood studying his books in the peace and solitude of the woods near his large estate. One of 4 children, quiet was something Jefferson would have valued. 1752 found a 9-year-old Thomas leaving his home to board with the teacher who gave him his early education, which he continued for 9 months every year until the age of 16. 1760 found Jefferson a reasonably well-rounded gentleman with a particular flair for classical languages. He studied science, mathematics, rhetoric, philosophy, and literature at the College of William and Mary, where he fell under the wing of Professor William Small, who had many notable connections among the aristocracy, such as Governor Francis Fauquier. Once leaving college, Jefferson prepared to become a lawyer, meeting with expert George Wythe, who made Jefferson one of the best lawyers in the colonies. After getting his law practice off the ground, Jefferson fell in love with Martha Wells Skelton, a recently widowed and the daughter of a wealthy Virginian landowner. Jefferson and Skelton married on January 1, 1772. In 1769, Jefferson became a member of the House of Burgesses, which brought him to fame as a patriot when he wrote Summary View of the Rights of British America in 1774, which gave his reasons for opposition of British control over the colonies. It was no surprise when Jefferson represented Virginia in the Continental Congress, given his reputation as a fantastic writer and an indomitable lawyer. It was even less surprising when in the Second Continental Congress, he was elected to write the newly coined Unanimous Declaration of the 13 States of America. It wasn't called the Declaration of Independence until later, to show the Congress's reluctantly decided stance of independence from Britain. Among the group was John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston, who all deferred to Jefferson to write the draft. This is to say, of course, that Jefferson did most of the work. After the Revolutionary War, Jefferson's wife died in childbirth, changing Jefferson forever. He became devoted to writing, was an ambassador to France, and before his presidency, served as George Washington's Secretary of State, where he fought frequently with Alexander Hamilton. At the time, candidates with the second highest vote number became vice president, which is how Jefferson found himself vice president to John Adams. Jefferson finally won the election of 1800 and was sworn in on March 4, 1801. For his domestic policy, he tried to focus on respecting the individual powers of the states and on peace. He wanted to put more influence on agriculture than commerce, and took away the standing military, favoring a militia instead. Jefferson faced great opposition from the Federalists, who made their stance clear in relation to the Democratic-Republican Party Jefferson had helped to found. To put it bluntly, they were like cats and dogs. They fought for control of the Congress and the Supreme Court, the radical Republicans urging Jefferson to replace Federalist officials, and the staunch Federalists already doing so with Republicans. Jefferson, who didn't believe that political parties should divide us, was under a large amount of shame from both sides. If anything, things were worse for Jefferson when it came to foreign countries. The United States is still a very new country, still learning how to cope with other nations and trying to stay out of trouble. George Washington himself had told the country in his farewell address to stay out of the affairs of other nations. This tenuous relationship was about to snap, however, and it began with Jefferson. First came the Barbary Wars, which was the first attempt since the Revolutionary War to stand up to another state. The Barbary states charged each and every ship going through their seas to pay up a tribute, and when their leader, Pasha of Tripoli, raised the price, Jefferson sent warships and initiated the Barbary Wars. Did this end well for the United States? Well, not really. We didn't lose, but we certainly didn't win. A truce was finally made that settled for the United States, paying an amount smaller than the original charge to Tripoli. The Louisiana Purchase happened when Jefferson, learning that the port of New Orleans had been given to France by Spain, made a deal with Napoleon that doubled the size of the nation. At the time, Napoleon's campaigns in Europe were racking up a high sum of money for France, and he needed money fast. So Napoleon, seeing a money-making opportunity, offered to sell the whole Louisiana territory to Jefferson for $15 million, which amounted to 4 cents an acre. The deal was one no one could refuse, and despite Jefferson's stance on strictly abiding to the Constitution, which said nothing about buying land, he went against his party and bought 828,000 square miles of virtually uncharted territory. For Jefferson, it probably seemed like a good idea at the time, but it ended up giving him far more grief than he anticipated. Britain and France had never been the best of friends, quite the opposite actually. And in the early 19th century, they weren't just rivals, they were at war. So when America waited to deal with their bitter enemy, Britain retaliated in a way that made Americans call for war. The British began capturing and impressing American soldiers into their navy. This in itself was a nuisance, a bit of an annoyance, but Jefferson had bigger problems, like maintaining that promise of neutrality that he broke before. It did become a problem, however, when the British fired on and killed 3 people in the Chesapeake on a naval frigate. As said before, the American people made a call for war, pressuring Jefferson into declaring something about Britain. Instead, Jefferson's quick fix was an embargo closing all ports to foreign trade. The Embargo Act put the country into an economic depression and had to be replaced with the Non-Intercourse Act, which simply banned trade with France and Britain. It was ignoring the problem, but it was a start. Like most presidents of the time, James Madison was born in a plantation in Virginia on March 16, 1751, in Port Conway. Known as the father of the Constitution, Madison played an instrumental role in writing our nation's structure. He represented Virginia with Thomas Jefferson in the Continental Congress and also in the Virginia Convention. When the Articles of Confederation were first instituted, Madison fought bitterly to change them, finally getting to write the Constitution, much like Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Elected to the House of Representatives, Madison was chief supporter to Washington. He also added the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, to pacify anti-Federalists who wanted a paper that guaranteed certain unalienable rights. With Jefferson's presidency, Madison served as Secretary of State, learning firsthand of the troubles that the United States faced. When president, he was popularly re-elected, due partially to his vivacious and social wife, Dolly Payne Todd. However, like all presidencies, Madison's had difficulties. For years, the French and British had been harassing American ships, and nothing he could do would stop them. The War of 1812 finally broke out when Madison found the British equipping the natives with weapons against American settlers. It was the last straw, consisting of bloody skirmishes, fierce naval battles, and famously the Battle of New Orleans, the last major battle of the War of 1812, which ironically enough took place after the war had ended. Often known as the Second War of Independence, like the Revolutionary War, Americans didn't gain much but knowing that they were safe in their beds once more. James Monroe, of all the early presidencies, probably was the most popular with the people. Known as the last cocked hat and the era of good feelings president, it's pretty obvious that America went through a happy period while under his leadership. Born on April 28, 1758, Monroe was the 5th president of the United States, starting his first term in 1817 and ending his second in 1825. After the War of 1812, the United States went through a period of economic growth and stability, known as the Era of Good Feelings, hence Monroe's nickname, the Era of Good Feelings President. Perhaps his success in the White House should be less attributed to his own endeavors, rather than the ones of his predecessor, James Madison, who actually won the War of 1812 and received half the popularity that Monroe had. Either way, America was feeling pretty powerful, having just defeated the most disciplined army in the world again. Maybe that is what made Monroe issue the Monroe Doctrine, which issued that if any European nation tried to colonize or recolonize the recently liberated South American countries, it would be seen as an act of war against the United States. This is meant specifically towards Russia, who was attempting to colonize some of the Pacific coast. Foreign matters aside, during Monroe's presidency, we had our own issues at home. At the time of Monroe, slaves were still being kept in the South, while the North remained slaveless. When the Missouri Territory applied for stateship, the North would admit it under one condition: it had to be a free state. The South, angered, wanted it to be a slave state, lest the North gain a political advantage in Congress. Neither would do nil till the territory of New Hampshire applied for statehood. Finally, the argument was solved and they agreed to admit Missouri as a slave state and New Hampshire as a free one. Andrew Jackson is probably one of the most infamous presidents in American history. Hugely popular with the American people, Jackson won his elections by saying that he was a self-made man, meaning that he was an aristocracy born, and he got himself to his position of political power. Jackson ranks notably high on the list constructed by historians, actually being remembered as one of the best presidents we had instead of a man who initiated the genocide of thousands of Native Americans. He came to fame in the Battle of New Orleans and the War of 1812, in which he was the leader of the American forces. The battle took place after the war had ended, but of course, Jackson didn't seem to acknowledge that. He was the founder of the Democratic Party, who, for all his faults, was an interesting person. He fought illegally in the Revolutionary War, where all his immediate family members were killed, and moved on afterwards to study law. He married Rachel Donaldson Roberts, a decision that would earn him ridicule for the rest of his life. Roberts wasn't officially divorced to her husband when she began living with Jackson, marking Jackson a wife-stealer. When president, Jackson was known for his firing officials who were not his supporters and replacing them with those who were. His kitchen cabinet was a group of qualified presidential cabinet members who he denied to actually be in his cabinet, favoring his own supporters instead. He met with these men in secrecy of his White House kitchen, hence the title, the Kitchen Cabinet. As president, he terminated the Second National Bank's charter, a decision that he would probably later regret. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 is probably what Andrew Jackson is most famous for, however. The Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Creek tribes were living in the land next to Georgia at the time. Disagreements between the natives and these settlers about land being taken from their tribes sparked two Supreme Court battles, Georgia versus Cherokees and Georgia versus Worcester. These two ended in the Supreme Court declaring that the Cherokee Nation was in fact an independent nation, which meant that the Indian Removal Act shouldn't have been able to happen anyway. But, in a startling display of power abuse, Jackson helped pass the law. The act promised that fair treatment and provisions would be given to all those being removed, but as the people found out too late, it was quite the opposite. The Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Creek tribes had mostly already left before the real act was passed, a product of harassment by settlers in Jackson. The Cherokees were the only tribe that was really affected by the Removal Act, and marched upon what is known as the Trail of Tears hundreds of miles away to what is now Oklahoma. It was called so because of the horrible hardships that the people being removed faced. Non-stop walking, small rations, cruel treatment from the soldiers escorting them. 4,000 out of 10,000 died. Arguably, the Indian Removal Act incited what could be called our own version of the Holocaust. For Jackson and the other Americans, however, it didn't really matter anyway. Because A, the natives weren't really people, right? And B, gold had already been found on the land they inhabited. So they had to go anyway, right? Either way, from the time the Europeans first landed in the Americas, the natives have been hunted to the point of extinction, through smallpox, and through men who think they own this world. Hopefully you know one thing about Richard Nixon. He left the White House in a state of disgrace and stepped down before it could be impeached. Born on January 9, 1913, in California, Nixon was a lawyer and naval officer before rising to political power in the Republican Party. He was 37th President of the United States from 1969 to 1974, and at first didn't really do anything out of the ordinary. Unfortunately for the United States, they were in another economic depression, which meant that one of Nixon's main concerns was solving the problem. In order to stop inflation in the economy, Nixon adopted gradualism, which restricted the money supply. In the end, though, gradualism was just too gradual and had to be taken back. On the other front, Nixon was working to build bridges with Russia and China in an attempt to ease Cold War tensions. In the end, like gradualism, he didn't really get any credit for that either. Through all of this, he and his Assistant of National Security Affairs, Henry Kissinger, kept Nixon's activities secretive. Then the Watergate scandal broke the news, which is what Nixon is so famous for. Apparently he thought he was above the law, which is why he recorded thousands of conversations from the Democratic Party's headquarters. When people found out, anger swept the nation, shaming Nixon forever, ending in the imprisonment of several Republican officials.